Please give a warm welcome to one of my favorite directors, Jeff Nichols. And welcome back, I should say. It's been since 2016 that you were here for Loving, but it's always awesome to have you back. When I introduced the film, Jeff, I mentioned that one of the things that I loved about your film, how it deals with identity and the fact that we all, of course, want to create our own identity, and then we gravitate to groups and counterculture. Can you talk about that aspect of your film?
Well, sure. You know, the first thing that came to me was the book of photographs by Danny Lyon, and I'm a huge fan of this era. I'm a huge fan of the music from this era. So you have all of these aesthetic things that support making a film, but that's not enough. So inevitably you have to start to say, well, okay, well, why are we going to do this? What is the purpose for making a film about a 1960s motorcycle club that metastasizes into a gang? And when you're looking for a universal theme, you want to find something that feels cyclical, something that has happened before and will happen again. And what I saw in the 90s, growing up in Little Rock, Arkansas, believe it or not, there was a really good punk rock scene there. Mm-hmm. And I saw a thing that was very homespun and very organic. The clothes that the kids made, the music that the kids made, it all felt very pure. But then by the end of the 90s, it started to shift, and it became popular. It became a thing that everybody was drawn to. And then I'm walking around in the mall listening to Green Day, and I'm wondering kind of what happened to this very organic, homegrown thing. Mm-hmm. And when
would you also illustrate in your film that also that once rules start creeping into that?
Of course, because you know the most interesting things get created on the outside edges of society. And you're not really sure why you're out there. You just know you have a feeling that you don't belong on the inside, so you go to the outside. But then, because you want to codify it, because you want to define it, you have to start creating rules for it. And the same thing happened in the punk rock scene. And so I thought, well, this is a cycle. And then you're looking at the world around you, and I think we're all searching for identity now more than ever. I think everyone is desperate to identify their lives to something. One, because it gives us purpose. Mm-hmm. And so we're turning to all these different things, you know, sex and race and history and culture. And the truth is, because we're social creatures, we turn to groups. We turn to groups to give us our identity. And the more unique a group is, in theory, the more unique your identity becomes. And that can be a really positive thing, but it can also be a very negative thing. And, you know, when you're looking at groups like the Proud Boys, you're wondering, okay, how did these people come together? How did these disaffected men come together to create such damage? It felt like something that was definitely resonating with the things that I was thinking about for the Bikeriders.
I'm glad you brought up the Proud Boys, because when I was watching your film, there was such a timeliness to the Bikeriders. Were you aware of America today when you were making the film?
Certainly. I mean, you can't avoid it. But then also, because of the type of filmmaker I am, the type of storyteller I am, I've always dealt with working class characters. It's how I grew up, but mine were all rural and southern, so that was different. But I'm always looking for understanding in these people, and why they operate the way they do, and why we make the choices that we make. And so I think it's very easy to look at these groups and kind of be appalled by them. But what I got from those photographs that Danny took, the interviews that were in the middle of that book is you get a lot of humanity, and you get a lot of understanding of why they're making these choices, why they're drawn or sometimes pushed to the outside, and the camaraderie that they feel once they get there.
You mentioned your filmography. Most of your films deal with, male identity, and what I find so intriguing about the Bikeriders is that the entryway into this world is Kathy. We're seeing it through a women's point of view. Can you tell us about Kathy? And yeah.
Yeah, of course. I love Kathy, and I wish I could say the choice was some great social political calculation, but it wasn't. In the book of photographs, there are interviews that Danny Lyon recorded with real people, and there was a real Kathy. And when you speak to Danny Lyon, he says she was the one that he was most drawn to. And you can just tell in the interviews on the page, she's just an extremely complex person. Mm-hmm. She's funny and self-deprecating and sometimes maddening and frustrating, but she's also introspective, and she has no problem taking a piss out of these bike riders. And so it seemed like the perfect person to be the one interpreting this group for us. And then the fact that, and this is part of kind of the fictionalization that happened when I wrote the script, when you tie that character into this love triangle, and it's not a love triangle of two men chasing after a woman, but it's a woman and an older man, both infatuated with a young man for different reasons, but also some of the same. Then you, in terms of narrative structure, you have your narrator now being drawn into the central drama of the script. So she's not just an observer; she's actually a participant in all of this. It felt very organic to the way this story should be told. And what better way, and Danny dealt, I think, with this in his photographs. You're certainly romanticizing maybe some people that shouldn't be romanticized. And I think Kathy fights with that. She sees kind of, to be quite honest, the bullshit of a lot of it. You know? And there's so much of that.
At the same time, she's enticed by it.
But then she loves it. She's drawn into it, and I think that's true, and I think it's honest. And so she felt like the right person to present that conundrum. I'm
glad you brought up the triangle aspect, because the film geek in me latched onto that. And it's not a sexual relationship. It's, Benny is almost like a cipher. It's like a vessel, and it's what Kathy puts onto him, and also what Johnny brings onto him. Can you talk about that dynamic, which is so rich?
Well, it's great you mentioned the word vessel, because that's the way I described it, which was actually difficult to say to an actor. I said, Austin, this is a tricky character because you're actually an empty vessel. You're this thing that these people are putting so much of themselves into. They're really putting all of their feelings and their future into you, but there's a hole at the bottom, and it just keeps coming out. Like you can't contain it. You can't bear the weight of other people's aspirations for you. And he's so damn charming. I just say, you got to stop smiling all the time, Austin. And he'd say, okay, boss. And I'd be like, no, stop smiling. You're supposed to be emotionally disconnected. And so, again, when you're talking about narrative structure and you're talking about really dramatic tension, if I could pull off creating a character that everyone was drawn to, but that character wanted nothing from other people, that would be pretty interesting. And by benefit of casting Austin Butler, no one questions, I don't think, why they're drawn to him. but it's pretty interesting, I think, that then he can't hold anything for them, but they desperately want to give it to him.
Talking about narrative structure, you do something pretty bold, and I mentioned it when I introduced the film. For the first half of the film, there's no plot. It's all feel, and we get to understand this culture. But it is a pretty bold attempt from a filmmaker not to have a narrative plot for the first half of the film. Can you talk about that, please?
Sure. Well, I've always thought plot was a little overrated, but which is why people think a lot of my films are really boring.
Who says that?
Somebody. But the truth is, if you look at Goodfellas and you ask somebody what Goodfellas is about, and they say, "Oh, it's about the guys that pulled off the Lufthansa heist," you would be confused. No one says that's what Goodfellas is about, but that's the plot. But you spend the first hour of that film really just being, lured into the romanticism of being a gangster. Mm-hmm. And that's very much the structure here. That first hour is about falling in love. Obviously, literally for Kathy, but also falling in love with these guys and their nature. And again, going back to that idea that we're seeing them in kind of an organic state. This is just something they feel like they want to be involved in and want to do. And I think that's very attractive and it's very appealing. Mm-hmm. And that's what that first hour really means. In terms of narrative structure, this was a really tricky script to write. It's why it took me 20 years to do it. Because how do you even do that? And so my first kind of breakthrough with it was I'm going to take, in the book, there's only one interview with Kathy, and she talks about her relationship with Benny, but I decided to break it into 3 sections. And we only give dates for 2 of them because when we put a third time signature on there, the audience got confused. But in the laundromat, it's 1965. In her bedroom and at her house, it's 1969. And then in the kitchen in Florida, it's 1973. But I knew that I would go in between these and go back and forth. Right. Because I didn't care about time, and I honestly just wanted people to watch it and not really think about it too much, just to be carried through the story. But it allowed me to always go kind of wherever I needed to get a piece of information from Kathy, because she can reach all the way back to 1959 when Johnny's watching Marlon Brando in The Wild One. But then in 1973, she can speak about 1971 when Johnny gets shot. So it was kind of like an anchor in the storm of all these different anecdotes and timelines and progressions through the 1960s. I always had Kathy to go back to in one of these stages. And I'm really proud, I don't know if anybody notices, but she's different in each one of those interviews. Mm-hmm. And we filmed them differently. The laundromat is loud and handheld and chaotic. And that's at the beginning when she's really in the throes of the romance of it. In 69, it's still handheld, but it's very still. So there's still energy there, and she's getting more introspective, but she's still in the middle of it. And then in 73, when we get to Florida, everything's on a tripod. Everything's locked off. Everything is very calculated, the way she talks about things. And Jodie's a good enough actor by far that she could handle those subtle shifts in each of those interviews.
You were talking about the script, but then the first half of the film also, we get a vibe, we get a feeling when we're watching the film, and this is where your production designer and your cinematographer and your costume designer, can you tell us about how, as a filmmaker, putting all those aspects together, you were able to create. It's just rare for me to watch a film where I'm writing, pun intended, on a feel. during the first half of the film. It's like I'm high on whatever fumes you're giving me. Can you tell us about calibrating that aspect of the narrative?
For sure, and I'll also say, I mean, obviously, it's so important to create that because at the end, that's what they're feeling. That's what he's thinking about at the end, and that's what she's thinking about at the end is this moment in time that's now lost. It's gone, and that's what nostalgia is. It's thinking back to a feeling that is so palpable that you can dip back into it almost any time you want if you smell something or if you hear something, and that's what that first hour is doing.
But can you be specific about the things that you task your crew to do? Like, for example, Adam Stone. You know, the cinematography. There's this autumn kind of feel, lighting, rusty, grainy look to the film.
Right. You know, it's really interesting. I think with a lot of period films now, because you have so much control in the DI, in the finishing, you can add lots of effects to things. We didn't add anything. We shot this just like the other films, but it was through the density of the costume, the hair and makeup, the production design, the bikes, the cars. When we set that film camera up to photograph it, all those layers compounded to give you a sense that you were taking a photograph in the 60s. And it literally is every department, decisions in every single department adding up to one thought. And I think one of the things that allowed us to do that was obviously the photos from Danny's book, but there was one in particular, and it was a color photograph that he released in this reissue in 2003. And it's just two guys sitting on a motorcycle at a gas station, but I sent it around to every department, and I was like, look at this photograph, and look at the density in this photograph. Look at the grease under their fingernails, and look at the way they've sewn their patches onto their jackets, and look at the way they've styled their hair, but then the grease in their hair after riding, on a interstate for 2 hours, how it's maddening looking. Look at the color of the gas tanks on the bikes. Look at the soda bottle in their hand. We got to think through all these things, guys, because we want the film to have the density of Danny's photographs. And I think and they all took that to heart. In terms of the autumn part, we just really lucked out. I always like to shoot in the fall. It's the best time. Usually the weather's temperate, so your crew doesn't get really angry. And the truth is, about October, something happens with the sun. It just shifts, and it becomes more beautiful. And when you're shooting on film, which we always shoot on film, it's just like an assistant that just delivers you good things every single day. And we were shooting in Cincinnati, Ohio, and there was just this 2-week period. We were trying to get all of our exteriors done up front in the schedule because we knew that it was going to get really, really cold, and that's not conducive to riding motorcycles. And just all of the trees changed colors right when we showed up to that location outside at the big picnic. And, it's just one of those things where it's a little bit of luck and a little bit of planning, and it ends up becoming a signature part of the film.
Well, because you earlier talked to us about, this moment in time that is gone, and then we look at the film and the lighting, and then we get this autumn-like feel and this rust feel that,
but it's also
it was intentional.
I guess to take some more credit for it, if you look at those night scenes, that's the way Adam Stone and our gaffer Michael Roy, that's the way they approach those. We've been wrestling with how to light night scenes our entire career together. We really didn't master it until Midnight Special. In fact, one of the technical challenges of Midnight Special that we wanted to master was lighting for film at night. And we kind of figured it out. So what you're seeing in the Bikeriders is kind of our master class. We know exactly where we want to put those lights, because one of my problems with a lot of contemporary cinema is that it's overlit. Mm-hmm. And so we we work pretty diligently at having just the right amount of light, and the nature of that light, which in this case is all motivated mostly by campfires. It ends up becoming really beautiful.
Speaking of campfires, the scene that blew my mind between Johnny and Benny, where they're talking about succession, and then their faces are lit. Well, they're not lit. There is complete darkness, and it foreshadows what's going to happen. Can you tell us about how you arrived to shooting that scene?
Yeah, a lot of credit has to be given to Tom Hardy. You know, because we were shooting on film and because it was night, there was a lot of pre-planning. We had to bring in a crane that was going to have an overhead light that would give kind of a base glow, and then we would kind of have lights kind of angled off of that to give harsher key light to their faces. And all of this was designed because we were going to have two actors facing each other, so we knew we would have Steadicam shots over their shoulders. It's not rocket science. But Tom Hardy, he has a way of getting in everyone else's shot, no matter where he is. In the bar scenes, I remember, like, he'd be at the end of a table and we'd be shooting a guy over here, yet his, like, hand with his cigarette would get in the shot. And so we're watching this scene, and I have my Steadicam operator, and it's meant to be an over-the-shoulder on Tom, and he just keeps getting closer and closer and closer to Austin, and my Steadicam operator is moving around, and if he had moved too far, we would have seen the base of our lighting crane in the background. And so he was trying to stay off of that, and Tom just gets closer, and he's such a smart actor. He knew exactly what he was doing. He gets right up next to him, and he can feel his face in the darkness, and he goes, and this piece of light comes across his face. And and you know, I've been married to my wife for 15 years now, and that has to be one of the most sexual experiences I've ever had, watching that scene.
Does she know about this?
I called her that night and had to tell her, you know, because Tom also, he works out a lot, and so you put him in this leather, and he would be talking, and he would just go, and I told him, you know, joking aside, at the end of that night, it was in our first week, it was the Thursday, we started on a Monday, and I said, look, guys, I dream all this stuff in my head. I have it all in my head before we get here, and my idea of a successful day is getting through the day and just getting the shots that I had in my head. That's awesome. I said, but every once in a while, you show up to work, and something's better than what I had in my head. And that's what you all did tonight. And it was awesome because it was in the first week of filming, and it kind of set the bar for what we were going to do. It felt like we were on to something.
Mm-hmm. The choice of handheld shots for the bike riding, that the camera is in front of the bikes. And I've seen the film only once, and I was blown away. Can you tell us how were you able to capture that feeling of handheld, but the camera is in front of the bicycles?
You're really good at this.
Oh, my goodness, thank you.
This interviewing thing, because you're really good at it.
Oh, it's very sweet, thank you.
Yeah, y'all are lucky to have him. You know, there's not, for being a motorcycle movie, there's actually not that much riding, and we spent so much time talking about how to photograph riding. Midnight Special, you know, we had kind of totally figured out how to shoot moving car scenes. And it's actually the one problem with shooting on film at night is when you're in a moving car. I don't shoot film simply because I'm some kind of purist and it's like, oh, that's the only way. That's not it. Film actually represents the human experience the best.
Correct.
And that's why we shoot on it, except when you're in a moving car at night. Because our eyes can hold the foreground and still hold the background in some exposure. But a film camera can't do that. There's just no way you could light it. So those are the only scenes in Midnight Special. And the one bike riding scene with Kathy is the only scene in this that is shot digitally. And it's for that reason. But so once we overcame that issue and made that concession, then we just talked about what it would feel like riding a motorcycle. And I stand by the fact that when you're shooting car scenes, you can spend lots of time doing lots of rigs, and people do, but the best thing is a handheld shot, you know, a 3/4 angle over the back of their shoulder from the back seat. It just feels like you're riding in a car.
Correct. Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that idea. It just feels the way that we experience it. And so we knew we wanted to do a handheld shot, but on a motorcycle. And we ended up getting basically a 3-wheel trike that was still gas-powered, but we could build platforms off of it, so that we had our camera operator hanging off the front of the motorcycle. But the problem with that is Austin Butler still had to actually operate the motorcycle and still act. But he's a talented guy. He could do both. And that was the cinema language that we found for it. The only trick there is then you have to add 1 or 2 wide shots just to sell the fact and let everybody know, no, they're really riding motorcycles. So you have to blend those 2 things together. But really, you want to get in close, and you want to get in up over the handlebars anyway. So that trike ended up being the solution for us for the more intimate shots on a bike.
Indulge me with one question. In Loving, you had the Gray Valet photographs that inspired the film, but those were black and white photographs, and you brought them into color and inspired the film. In this instance, now you have the Danny Lyon photographs, which are black and white, and then you were able to grab the feel of those black and white photographs, and you brought them into live in this film. Can you tell us about that dynamic? And it happens in the 2 historical films you've made back to back. Is that a coincidence?
Now that you mention it, no, I guess it's not. No, I mean, I've always been drawn to photography. You know, I made a film called Mud on the Mississippi River.
Correct.
And that film was partially inspired by a book of photographs that I found called The Last River, and it was about people making a living on the Mississippi River. And that's where I got the idea of an underwater diver for mussel shells with a garden hose connected to a hot water heater that he had cut off to make a helmet. So I've always been drawn to photographs. One, because they tell you so much, but they aren't prescriptive. You know, like a book or something that has to lay everything out. A photograph just gives you an impression of a thing, and then you get to bring all of these things to it. What is that person doing? Was that person angry that day? Or you get to bring your own story to it. So as a writer, I think that's very interesting to me. And that was a big part of looking at Danny Lyon's photographs. They're very intimate. There's so much information in them, but the whole story's not there. So for me, it was kind of this privilege that I got to basically write this fictional narrative on top of these really concrete, beautiful images. And then, you know, to be more specific, I was drawing scenes inspired by an image. So the first real photograph that you see at the end of the film is the real Benny leaning over a pool table. And so obviously that became an inspiration for the way that Kathy would see him for the first time. Not because that's the way Kathy saw him for the first time, but that's the way I saw him for the first time. And it was funny, the day we shot that, Danny Lyon was on set visiting, which was a little nerve-wracking. And, you know, that was going to be a push-in, because I knew that would be her point of view. We were going to over-crank it, so it was slow motion, and we would start and slowly move in on him. And Danny walked into the bar set, and we were in the B position of the dolly. So you have an A position that's wide and the B position that's close. And he's looking at it, and it was, you know, this tight shot on Austin Butler. And he said, "That's an okay shot, Jeff." He's like, "But you know, I was taught when you take a photograph, you should always show their hands." I was like, "Oh, well, that's good." And then we got onto something else, and the dolly grip moved the dolly back to the A position, which shows his hands because it matches the photograph perfectly. And he comes over and he's like, "That's a much better choice." And he didn't realize I had planned it that way all along. But these photographs were. He then asked for a co-directing credit. But yeah, you know, they just show up all the way through the film. They were kind of an aesthetic and a spiritual anchor for the film.
Can you tell us about the casting? Your three leads happen to be all they're not Americans, but they're like ultimately playing these uber American characters. Was that intentional on your part? Jodie Comer, Tom Hardy, Austin Butler.
It wasn't. It was intentional in Loving because I had audio of Richard and Mildred Loving, and I had seen Joel Edgerton in Midnight Special break down an American accent. And I was so impressed by the work that he did to break that accent down. I knew that if I gave foreign actors a real specific guide to an American accent that was very specific, that they would have the mechanics as actors to break those voices down. And maybe there are definitely American actors that can do that, but I knew they would be able to do that. And that was Loving. But I'd already kind of been through that process. The truth is, I really didn't know Jodie Comer's work when I started talking to her. Francine Maisler, my casting director, is the one that recommended her. I hadn't seen Killing Eve, but you know, a person's name kind of comes up, and then everyone's like, "Oh, you have to talk to Jodie Comer. You have to talk to Jodie Comer." They knew what I didn't, and to be honest, I called my friend Adam Driver, who worked with her on The Last Duel, and he was like, "She's the best. She's just the best." So then, you know, this kind of this idea starts to really build and grab weight, and so I Zoomed with her, and she said yes, and that was kind of it. It's kind of the same experience that I had with Jessica Chastain on Take Shelter. I didn't really know her. I didn't know any of her work because she hadn't released any films yet when I was casting her. But Terrence Malick had said she was good, and that was good enough for me. But then I was lucky enough to be on the jury of Cannes a couple years back, and I was coming through London to actually meet with Tom Hardy to discuss the role of Johnny. But that night, I had a ticket to Jodie's one-woman show on the West End.
Prima Facie?
Yes.
Which is incredible.
She just won a Tony for it on Broadway. And I walk into this, and I watch this young woman perform for an hour and a half, no one else on stage, and it's the most incredible performance I've ever seen an actor give. And I walked out of that theater thinking, like, I'm the luckiest director in the world. Like, I have an ace up my sleeve because she's Kathy, and just wait till Kathy shows up. And it's true, you know, at the end of, because we had audio of the real Kathy, and which is the thickest Chicago accent. Like, this is actually, believe it or not, this is actually backed off a little bit. But obviously Jodie has a lot of lines, and she left some of her work behind one day, and I looked down at this piece of paper, and she'd phonetically broken down every single word of her dialogue. And then what's amazing is you don't see it. She does all that work, but then it becomes invisible. I can't say enough about Jodie Comer. And then, yeah, sure, she's the best. And then you have Tom Hardy. I mean, who doesn't want to work with Tom Hardy? You know, well, maybe some
Especially
people.
if he's flexing his muscles to
Yeah,
the
right.
leather jacket.
But Tom's such an unusual actor. He gets bored really fast. In fact, he would kind of do one take and kind of go like, "You're welcome." And I said, "Tom, now we're shooting on film. It's like a chemical process happening in the camera. You got to give me at least 3 takes." He's like, "Well, I get bored really easy, Jeff." I was like, "Just give me 3." And but he's like a force of nature. It's like a tornado or a hurricane watching him act. You're not really sure what's going to happen. But just below his skin, there's like a subtle vibration. And every time you put the camera on him, you can't take your eyes off of him. He's a movie star. And we were just lucky that he said yes. And then for Austin Butler, Elvis had not come out yet. I'd seen him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a film I really love. And I was out in L.A., and he had gotten his hands on the script and wanted to meet me. And again, you know, I'd just seen him in this one movie. I didn't watch like the Disney Channel or whatever, and this guy walks up and he's like 6'2", and he holds out his hand and he smiles, and I just fell in love with the guy. I was like, well, this is the most beautiful human being I think he's actually more attractive in person than he is on screen.
Guy.
And I knew immediately from talking to him, one, that he was a good human being and charming and nice and smart. But I knew that these other two characters, it would make sense. The movie would make sense if I had this gentleman working with me. So I gave him the part on the spot.
I lied. One last question. Michael Shannon. He's in every single film of yours. Tell us about Michael Shannon.
He's my brother. He's more than a collaborator. Like, at this point, we're just, I don't know what we are. Codependent. But I had audio of this character, Zipco. And Michael Shannon grew up partly in Chicago. And he doesn't always speak in that voice, but I had heard it before, and it sounded just like this character. And I knew that I had these two beautiful monologues, one about Pinkos and one about the draft. And I knew that if Mike showed up, something special would happen, and if nothing else, it would give the other actors something to listen to. And so our first day of filming actually was Mike giving that speech about Pinkos. And it was amazing to watch all these other actors sit around and just watch Michael Shannon talk all day long. And then by the time we got around to the one by the campfire, it's funny. And when I heard it for the first time, the guy talk about his mom waking him up and dragging him into the draft board, I thought it was funny. And Mike sits me down before the scene and he goes, "You think this is funny, don't you?" I was like, "Yeah, I do, Mike. I think it's a good monologue." And he's like, "I don't think it's funny at all." And I was like, "Okay, well, just show me what that means." And so he's talking and he's telling the story and he gets everybody laughing. And then he gets to the back end of it and he's like, "They don't want you." And like everyone's faces dropped. And it was all on the page. He didn't change any of the dialogue. But he owned it in a way that it shifted the intention of the whole scene. And then all of a sudden, it makes sense. And you're like, oh, this is why they don't feel like they belong. To the point to where Norman Reedus was with us that night, who was only there for a few nights. And in the film, his character sticks around with the club. And he comes up to me and he was like, "That's why I stick around." And you're like, and that's what Michael Shannon does.
Well, before I let you go, gang, you have homework to do. If you have not seen Take Shelter, Mud, Midnight Special, my personal favorite, and Loving, you have homework to do. This is one of the best filmmakers working in cinema today. So do your homework and spread the word. The film opens December 1st. And thank you so much, Jeff, for being here tonight with us.
Thanks for having me.